الآن محاضرتنا الختامية مع الدكتور سيفان سعيد.
One will be for Seveen Saeed.
في الداخل.
He is inside. He is coming to the stage now. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. I thought it's going to be longer than what it is. Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Dr. Seveen Saeed, he is a doctor in the policy in the Middle East from Esther, and he specialized with the political issue affairs, and he's lecturer now in the Shanxi in China.
Yes.
Please,
Good afternoon.
stage is yours.
I'm so proud that I am in Syria, in northeast Syria and Rojava, and participating in some historical important event that the good attempt to bring the crime of the century, the biggest crime in this area actually, into the justice. And this is any attempt, whether small or big, must be all of us be proud of. And my participation in this panel actually to avoid controversy and to avoid wasting the time, I would like to read my paper, which is covering the ideological point of ISIS. I know everybody in this room repeatedly listening to this sentence that they say physically and militarily ISIS is finished, but ideologically ISIS could be still there for a long, long time, as we see in the case of other organizations, more recently in case of Al-Qaeda. So my paper is the root of fundamentalist ideologies, whether the ISIS is a result or a cause. Social theories tell us that the ideology never fully fades away. It's implanted in the mind, growing up, dominating and diminishing gradually. In practice, however, in some circumstances, the ideology will be distorted and transferred into another form of and set of mind. We have a German philosopher called Karl Mannheim. He argues that the ideology cannot be abstracted from utopia, in which the chance of practice of the ideology is very less. In other words, the products of ideology that is supposed to form a perfect or at least better world could not be easily brought into reality. Often would be even impossible. On the other hand, coming from the famous quote by Karl Marx that suggested that every ideology will grow a snake in its arms, and the snake one day will be hitting itself before any other opponents. Thus, ideology can be distorted by the followers, or perhaps reshaped in a way that could hardly be recognized as it was in the first hand. Bringing another example to my argument, actually, it is often mentioned that Jesus Christ was the first victim of his ideology, his religion, what he came for. If we can bring back Jesus Christ here today with us, he would be certainly not accepting the practice and ideas that is nowadays implemented on his name. He would never like the idea of spending billions of euros to rebuild Notre Dame church, while in the same moment in Paris, you know this church that has been burned recently, just in front of the church you can see hundreds of poor people who are begging for one slice of pizza. So Jesus cannot be accepting this as the ideology that he brought it for, the justice and equality. Thus, that we can see the practice of religion or any other ideologies, such as socialism or social justice or democracy whatsoever, is in the world could be seen at anything but the exact ideas that the people have seen it for the first hand by the first ideologue. Therefore, we can see in the reality the religion can be distorted very easily. What I try to say mainly about Middle East is that all these organizations that are having it here, whether they are positive or negative, in this case we are talking about ISIS, has a root of cultural history and religion and all these elements that shaping them as it is now we saw them. describing religion especially as an ideology that motivating the fundamentalist groups such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda and other is not coming from nowhere, therefore. It is, as it's been mentioned yesterday by some of the good scholars here, it is actually has a legitimate base when someone accusing religion for making some of, at least has a share of this chaos that we see now in the Middle East. What is called political Islam, however, or Islamist project, al-Mashru' al-Islamawiyya, since the very early beginning of the political Islam, through the 18th and 19th century via Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abda, through the Muslim Brotherhood mainly actually for the last 100 years, these until the emergence of ISIS, all have been some kind of referral from the religion to what we can see, and more importantly, from the history of the Islamic rulers, al-Hukam, al-Islam al-Dawla. That's what I want to say actually, to avoid controversy. Therefore, I would stand against the claim that says all what we can see is going on in the world, Islamic world, is the outcome of the bad interpretation of Islam, of the religion, by humans and by people. That couldn't be the good argument in this respect. It can be some reality in it, but not total reality in it. Indeed, Islam itself and religion and holy books has a share of producing fundamentalism. However, it would be more accurate and appropriate if the criticism would be towards the political institution of Islam and Islamic history and practice of Islam in various places and times. I would argue that the holy text is a product of the particular historical events, and what we see in the nowadays practice of Islam is based on some part of historical events that happened. For example, if the Shia institution 1,400 years ago was successful during the conflict of the very early of Islam, we could have a different practice nowadays, the matter of majority or minority of Shia and Sunni Muslims. Therefore, I would like to say, in fact, there's a big room for interpretation and practicing the idea of religion in the way that the cause of the huge problem for the people and society can be somehow legitimized. I would argue that, on the other hand, the history of Islamic society and the rulers mainly, which is, I'm talking about Islam al-Dawla, laysa Islam al-Mujtama', the history of Islamic societies and the rulers are full of these conceptions, using the interpreting the text in the will of the rulers through the gaining legitimacy of the interpretation by the scholars who are hired by the rulers. Sultan Wa'ad al-Salatin have always been part of the policy and power seekers. Empires and rulers like sultans and caliphs were always legitimizing their own desire and indeed criminal actions through the power of holy books and the religious figures. The notion of Arabization and Islamization that is coming from the idea of unification can be traced somehow from the religious fundamentalism that have been widely adopted by the rulers of the region and mainly manifested through the phenomenon of the nation-state system. Al-Ba'ath Party, as you know all in this room, the main slogan of Al-Ba'ath Party was emphasizing on the one nation which is only Arab and has an eternal message for humanity. Umma Arabiyya wahida dhata risala khalida. The Turkish state notion, on the other hand, just next door, has the same unification notion in its slogan, as it says, one nation, one flag, one language, and one state. These are exactly coming from the fundamentalist ideology that can easily produce and promote extremism. The point I would like to argue here and highlight is a newly and suddenly emerging groups such as ISIS, Daesh, cannot be abstracted from the long history of the violence and fundamentalist thoughts that exist throughout history. It is in fact a sort of producing the practice of ideology of fundamentalism that has been noted long ago in society. Therefore, the ideology that has been derived from the Islam and holy text of Quran and Prophet Muhammad hadith, and in some cases in different practices elsewhere from the families of prophets and different practices in the Middle East can have some referral in this. On the other hand, the crisis and increasingly creating problems by the rulers and the power seekers who have interest in the chaos, having a huge contribution in reviving and reproducing and promoting the ideology of fundamentalism and extremism. Yet, we cannot say that the total accusation would be on the Islam. We cannot accuse Islam and religion in general for all these chaos we have in the Middle East. Indeed, there are several other important factors that could lead and help the notion of Islamic fundamentalism. Nonetheless, the root of the issue of hegemony and power of Islamic discourse and historical strength that has always power and capacity to reproduce and re-manifest itself again and again. Therefore, we can argue that the issue of fundamentalism can be tackled in different ways. The phenomenon of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, all those groups that emerged very recently, all extremist terrorist groups that have been produced and come out from the womb of Islamic fundamentalist ideology in the last 100 years could be seen as one dialectical process of interrelation between the idea of fundamentalism and the practice of extremism that have been recycling and reproducing each other again and again. Solution to the crisis and the chaos of the Middle East could be strategic, long-term, and radical solution rather than just tackling the crisis by confronting the little event that is happening often. In other words, counting the notion of fundamentalism and tackling the issue of extremism cannot be achieved through the partial solution and other same mentality, and with the same mentality as the producer of fundamentalism itself. In other words, I would like to say this, the Western program for de-radicalization cannot change anything as long as the state mentality is implementing the program of de-radicalization. That's what we can see in London and New York. Billions of dollars will be spent each year for de-radicalization, but it will be actually more promoting for radicalization. The last point I would like to say, a democratic, just, and full of the hope of the people in the region alongside the long-term democratic education program can be the base of tackling the issue of fundamentalism and extremism in the Middle East, fighting the notion of unification, which is an assimilation through promoting diversity and freedom of manifesting identities of various religious, social, cultural, and ethnic groups can be a ground of democratic practices for to make a social and societal changes in the Middle East. Establishing democratic and justice, the management which is based on justice through the will of the people themselves with their own different identities could be a great opportunity to think of a better... 2 seconds. 2 seconds. 2 seconds, because I was working hard for it. Give me less than 1 minute, please. Yeah. As long as the project says within the range of democratic ideology, social justice, and radical participatory notion, there will be a big hope to make positive change and practice in establishing a new democratic and justice in the Middle East. Thank you.
شكرا للدكتور سيفان على التزامه بالوقت لأنه هو تنازل عن وقته.
Thanks.
بقي محافظا على الوعد الذي خطأه.
Thanks.